In this video, we'll be talking about long exposure photography. Hello and welcome back to the channel. This is Dylan Golby. In today's video, we're going to be talking about long exposure photography with the Fujifilm X100V. While the camera itself isn't a specific issue for long exposure photography, there are a few questions that I do get with regards to Fujifilm cameras in general, and specifically the X100 series, so we'll address those and then jump into using long exposures to create mood. First up, let's talk about the camera. As with a lot of Fujifilm bodies, you can only go down to 1 full second when using the shutter speed dial on the X100V, and in order to get access to longer shutter speeds than that, you need to either switch to B for bulb or T for time. We'll be talking about T mode here today. T stands for time, and once the camera is in that mode, you're able to access shutter speeds beyond 1 second using the rear command dial. With previous X100 series cameras, you were only able to get to 30 seconds as a programmable speed, but now with the X100V you can go all the way up to 15 minutes. That's really useful for things like using a 16 or 20 stop filter to be able to get streaky clouds during the day and things like that. But for the most part, you're likely to use maybe 1 or 2 minutes at most. One setting that I have turned off in all of my cameras is long exposure noise reduction. What this setting does is it tells the camera to make 2 images for every long exposure that you make. So if you press the button for a 15-second exposure, it will make the 15-second exposure that you have asked it to make, and then it will close the shutter and make a second 15-second exposure with the shutter closed, which will be a black or a dark frame, and then it will use that to subtract the noise from your first image. While that may seem like a good thing in the beginning, consider that you're making a 15-minute exposure. You make a 15-minute exposure, the camera then makes another 15-minute exposure, which means you only get to make an image every 30 minutes. Or, let's say you're shooting a sunset or a sunrise when the light is changing rapidly, and you're making, say, a 30-second exposure. Now it will make 2 of those, and you will only be able to make an image every minute, which means you might miss the critical moment. The way that I look at it is, we're going to be doing some post-production on our images anyway, so we can do a more refined job of removing noise in software after the fact. The one final thing that we need to consider with the X100 series cameras is that they don't have a standard filter ring on the front. You actually need an adapter, which comes as part of the hood kit. Fujifilm sells these, a lot of third-party manufacturers sell them. What this is it screws into the front of the lens here, and then from there you get access to a standard filter thread, and you can attach filters or attach filter holders to the front of the camera now. Now I recommend getting this anyway for a couple of reasons. The first one is with the X100V, you actually get a fully weather-sealed camera if you put this and a filter on the front. But the other reason is this lens, the glass of this lens, is just so close to the front of the camera that I'd rather not risk scratching it or damaging it in any way, so I put the hood on at all times when I'm using this camera. So now that we've got the settings out of the way, let's jump onto the computer and take a look at a couple of sets of images that I made on a recent trip to write my Tattoos of Asia book. So I was staying in a small town on the east coast of Korea, and the east coast tends to get pretty large swells during the winter. It's about the only place in the country where you could really go and do any surfing of any kind, so you get these beautiful sort of huge waves crashing over the rocks on the coastline there, and there are some areas where the towns are really close to the coast, and there have been breakwaters and things built along the coastline as well. So for this first set of images, what I wanted to capture were the waves crashing over the tetrapods on the coastline. The ocean, regardless of how powerful and merciless it can seem at times, has always been a place of calm for me. And so the first thing that I did after I found a composition was pull out my Haida M7 kit and consider how to make a long exposure of these tetrapods. So let's jump on and have a look at those. In this first image, I put a 6-stop filter on the front of the lens, which gave me an exposure time of 13 seconds, just before the sun was coming up. As you can see, the ocean retains some texture in the background, but the whitewash of the crashing waves over the tetrapods has become more of a smooth outline than an actual representation of how powerful the waves are. I made a few images like this, but quickly realized that although I love the calm feeling the long exposure brought to the ocean, it didn't feel like what I was witnessing at the time. So I began to experiment with different exposure times, and after a while I found that a 1/5 of a second showed the power of the ocean while still retaining a little of that abstract feeling that I'd had with the long exposure. Once I'd established that, I focused on my timing. With the long exposures, I was recording several different waves crashing over the tetrapods during one exposure and turning them into an abstract piece. But with a single wave, I would need to find the moment where the crashing wave gave the emotion that I got from the scene. So in this first image, the wave has just crashed over the front tetrapods as I made the exposure. While this definitely shows the power of the wave, I don't get any separation in the tetrapods. In the second image, I picked the peak moment just as the waves were really starting to come over the tetrapods. You can really see the power in the waves because of the streaks that are coming around the tetrapods, but I still didn't feel like this gave me the same feeling that having whitewash on both sides of the tetrapods did. I didn't feel like the waves were crashing over and just stopping short of the shoreline. I felt like they were really being stopped by the tetrapods. In this final image, as the wave has completely crashed over the tetrapods, I get the feeling that although they've stopped it, the wave still has some power left in it. And that's really what I was feeling as I was sitting there watching the waves crash over the tetrapods. So for this next set of images, I was actually testing Haida's new interchangeable magnetic variable ND filter. That's a mouthful. But that gave me access to 9 different stops of ND power just by turning the filter on the lens, so I was able to get a range of different feelings out of this one scene. So in these first few images, where we're using shutter speeds ranging from 1/3 of a second to 1.3 seconds, you can see that there's still quite a bit of texture in the water, and although it feels a little bit ethereal and a little bit departed from reality, we can still definitely see that it is water that's flowing around rocks, and we can see the path that the water is taking. As we add more strength to the ND, the water starts to take on an almost misty feeling, like we're on a high peak looking down at clouds in a valley. As you can see looking at the 2 images on the right, depending on the timing you choose, depending on how much whitewash the waves are creating, you can really play with how much you can see under the water versus above the water. Once we start to get into shutter speeds of 20 or 30 seconds, all texture is completely removed from the water, and the images take on a really abstract kind of feeling. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, the ocean for me is a very calm place, and so even though the waves were crashing over these rocks quite violently, I'm actually a fan of the middle and the right images a little bit more so than I am of the one on the left. And the reason for this is it gives a sort of smoothing effect to the water, and in this one I feel like we're seeing just basically wisps of clouds between the rocks here, and here it's almost like a piece of glass, and so for me that gives a more calm feeling than the one on the left, which I can sort of see the violence in the waves still. I can see those streaks of movement from the whitewash on the water. So I hope that this discussion about the effects of long exposures on water has been useful to you. I'd like to hear which of the 2 feelings you prefer in your own images and why in the comments below. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.